All right, so one of the things that we talked about on Tuesday was this idea of the conversation metaphor, which is really meant to be used as a tool for us to kind of understand and frame the way in which the various assignments and writing tasks in this class are interrelated. What I want to talk about more so in this video is the idea of the rhetorical situation, which is a huge concept that we are going to be using quite a bit throughout the semester. And what it's meant to do is offer us a way to rhetorically break down texts, whether that be texts that we're reading or texts that we ourselves are writing. But in order for us to understand the rhetorical situation, we obviously first have to understand what we mean when we talk about rhetoric in this class. So I would like to draw your attention to this image right here with these two gentlemen who are meant to represent Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And as you'll see, Aristotle is holding a book that is entitled Rhetoric. Around the time of, I want to say 300 to 400 BC, Plato and Aristotle were developing these rhetorical ideas, the same ones that we are going to be talking about in this class. So we're going to be working with these concepts that were created and developed and refined many years ago. At the same time, I decided to include this, the Facebook logo as well as the Twitter logo, because while these concepts are ancient and while these concepts are based on antiquity, we also use them today in ways that we don't quite always, that we're not always aware of. We use them on social media. We use them when we're texting a friend. We use them in the day-to-day. So part of what this class is meant to do is to kind of bridge the gap between these ideas that have been around for ages and ages relating to rhetoric and the way in which we use rhetoric and rhetorical writing in our own life. But before we can even begin to think about or try to understand these concepts, we have to first define rhetoric. So what does this word mean in the context of this class? We have kind of an official definition here. The Oxford English Dictionary defines rhetoric as the art of using language effectively so as to persuade or influence others, the study of principles and rules to be followed by a speaker or writer striving for eloquence, especially as formulated by ancient Greek and Roman writers. So this definition tends to connect to the kind of rhetoric we're talking about when we're talking about rhetoric in Plato and Aristotle's time. Some of you might have also heard the definition not pictured here. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, which is also a perfectly good definition. How we define it in this class is a little bit, it's a bit of a more loose definition. We define it as doing things with words, so using language in order to achieve a purpose. Now, in order for us to understand how this works in our reading and in our writing, we need to look at the rhetorical situation, or as it's sometimes called, the rhetorical triangle, which is basically just a diagram that breaks apart writing into several different components. We have audience, we have purpose, author, text, and context. Now, some of you might be familiar with looking at writing this way, whereas for some of you, this might be entirely. Either way, this is the lens through which we look at writing in this particular class. So in doing so, we really take into consideration these various components when we're looking at any writing or reading. So I'm going to kind of take you through these one by one. So we start off with this idea of the author. An author, in the context of a rhetorical writing situation, is a person who creates a piece of rhetoric. Now, when we think about this text, we want to think about the way in which our understanding of the author helps shape our understanding of the text. So in doing so, we want to think about the fact that every author's thoughts and words are shaped by their values, beliefs, and assumptions. These values, beliefs, and assumptions are influenced by a lot of different factors, including age, socioeconomic status, education, experience, and culture or subculture. One example of this is if I were reading a text that was telling me what the best shoe to buy is. I might read that text differently depending on who the author is. For instance, if the author is a very well-known podiatrist who really knows which shoes are the best shoes, then that might shape my understanding of the reading and the meaning involved in that reading, right? However, if I am reading an article that's actually not an article but kind of an ad by the CEO of Dr. Scholl's, that's going to give me some insight into how I interpret the text. So really, taking this component into consideration when we're looking at a reading can really help us to better understand and better evaluate what we're reading. So moving right along here, we have several examples of authors. I mean, we have your standard example that you generally think of when you think of an author, William Shakespeare, authors you've read throughout your high school and college career. But we also have different kinds of authors. As we move through this class, we're going to be thinking about text in different ways and thinking about text as something larger than just writing. Thinking about how a text might be a painting or an advertisement or a podcast. And with this mindset, we also think about authors as being something broader than our more traditional understanding of an author. So Lady Gaga could be an author. Taylor Swift could be an author. Beyonce could be an author. And of course, you in this class should be considering yourself an author. So that takes care of author. The other concept that we're going to talk about quite a bit in this class is this idea of audience. An audience is a person or group the author writes to. Like authors, audiences' thoughts are shaped by their values, beliefs, and assumptions. Many of the same factors that affect authors also affect audiences. So anytime we're creating a text, we want to be thinking about who our audience is. And we might have many audiences. But at the same time, we want to be thinking about who we're most trying to reach. And in doing so, we want to think about the same things we think about when we think about an author: age, socioeconomic status, education, experiences, culture, or subculture. Now, audience is something that we already have an innate sense of as social human beings. Whether or not we're aware of it, we are often shaping our message, our idea, or our texts in order to accommodate our audiences and help our audiences to better understand us. For instance, you might talk differently to a 2-year-old than you would to a 7-year-old, even though you might be delivering the same message. You might construct an email differently that you're sending to a professor versus your parents versus your roommate. I know that when I was in graduate school and I was trying to explain my thesis, I would talk about it differently with my parents and my family than when I would talk about it with my advisors, because my advisors already understood a lot of the work I was doing. My advisors already kind of interacted and used a certain kind of academic language. But when I was explaining it to my family, in order to help them understand what it was that I was trying to do, I had to kind of explain it in different ways, use different words, and shape my message so that my audience could follow me and so that I could ultimately achieve my purpose in helping them to understand what it was that I was trying to do. So in this class, we'll see how understanding and recognizing the needs of our audience really can help us in creating a text that is rhetorically effective. So we want to think about the different kinds of audiences we have. We have our professors, and we often think of our professors as our only audience, but we also want to be branching out of that in this class and thinking about what other kind of audiences might you in your writing life have to communicate to. We could also think of moviegoers as audiences that are observing a text of a different kind, right? People who are creating a movie have a certain purpose in mind as authors, and they're oftentimes trying to reach a particular audience, depending on if the movie is an action movie or a romance or an independent film. And then you want to think about yourself as an audience too. In this classroom, you're an audience. And in the readings that you do in this class, you're an audience of the authors that you read, as well as when you are helping your peers. There are many different kinds of audiences, and us understanding who our audiences are help us to become better readers and writers. So we understand this idea of author. We understand that there's an audience that the author is writing to. We also want to think about this idea of purpose. The purpose is the outcome the author hopes to achieve with a piece of rhetoric. Every effective piece of rhetoric has a focused purpose and a specific goal. Again, while a piece of rhetoric might have multiple purposes, there's generally one that is kind of the ultimate focus of the piece of rhetoric, right? So in our experiences writing, there are lots of different purposes that could come from various texts. So your purpose might be to explain or to inform your audience about something, a particular topic. It might be to explore a particular idea or concept. It might be to entertain. It might be to reflect. It could be to convince your audience of something. So we want to be thinking about the way that purpose can really shape what we're doing in our text. How does a persuasive piece differ from an explanatory piece? How does that differ from a reflective piece? Okay, so purpose, also very important. Lastly, we want to look at this idea of text, right? So audience, author, purpose, they all work to shape a text. And a text, for the purposes of this class, is defined as any piece of rhetoric. The text is shaped by all 3 points of the rhetorical triangle: audience, purpose, and author. These 3 elements also determine the genre and the medium of the text. So when we're considering the kind of text that we use, the kind of genre that we use, we want to really think about the different components that are involved: audience, purpose, and author. For instance, if I really want to get a message out about the environment, and I want to reach an audience of a population that is maybe in their later years, 70 or over, 70 plus. This is the population that I'm trying to reach. Using a tweet or using Twitter to get my message across may not be the best way to reach that particular population. So oftentimes we really want to be thinking about these 3 components when we think about the kind of genre and the kind of medium that we use, right? So as I've already kind of stated here, there are a lot of different kinds of texts, and this idea of a text goes beyond just the idea that we're normally accustomed to when we think of that word. It goes on beyond the idea of writing. We could think of speeches as text. We obviously think of articles as text, but text messages, emails, paintings, advertisements, songs, plays, all of these are texts that have a kind of specific purpose and are generally geared to a specific audience, right? So we're going to be looking at broadening our idea of text, of the word text in this class. Now, the last piece that I want to look at here is that of context, which, not that, but there we go, which I'm sure you've heard before, and I'm sure it's not an unfamiliar concept to you, but for the purposes of the rhetorical situation, we're talking about context in this way. The context is the environment that surrounds a text and casts light on its meaning. So the context of a text is determined by outside forces, including history, society, culture, politics. So the way in which we read a text is often shaped by the context that's happening around it. For instance, when we read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, our understanding of that text is shaped by the fact that we know that the civil rights movement was happening. Also, the fact that MLK wrote that letter while he was in Birmingham jail, just knowing that fact in itself kind of affects how we understand the text. So these are some of the ways that we see context shaping our understanding of a text. And as we move forward in this class, we'll be thinking about how all of these rhetorical elements interrelate. So we'll continually come back to this model when we look at reading and we look at our writing.